10, yeah.
And so Tim is a sports psychologist. Tim, will you tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you've been up to?
You bet. Here, let me go ahead and share my screen as well. So yeah, why don't I, oh, hang on one sec. There we go. All right. So yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, it is after 10. Luckily, I'm a night owl, so that works for me. So I'm an avid sailor. More small boats and more dinghy racing than anything, but a little bit of cruising and slightly bigger boats. But I love integrating principles of sport and performance psychology with anything sailing. Bringing together my two passions. I sailed all growing up and raced and sailed through college and coached college sailing for a bit. And I also spent a lot of years pursuing expertise in psychology and sports psychology, did a couple master's degrees, did a doctorate, focusing on, both clinical psychology and counseling psychology, along with, performance oriented stuff the whole way through. I actually, during my doctorate, I joked that, I don't know, I think by the time I was done, it was like my 26th or 27th year of schooling, but I joked in my 24th year that I was a double senior because, 12 times 2 at that point, right? In any case, my practice, Reaching Ahead, it's located in Annapolis, Maryland. Actually, one more thing I'll say about my background prior to setting up here in Annapolis. My first full-time gig which was very much focused on performance psychology, was actually in your state. I was living in Tacoma, and I was working at Fort Lewis and basically applying principles of sport and performance psychology to military performance. And I loved it. And, it was a great population to work with. And at the same time, given that I had this dual training, I missed having opportunities to help people on deeper stuff when deeper stuff was popping up, right? So a young soldier would start talking to me about symptoms of PTSD and what have you. And I'd be like, I could go there, but I can't, and it was a young program too. So it would, the referral systems weren't that good. And I think they've improved since then. But in any case, so I shortly thereafter set up private practice in Bozeman, Montana, where my fiance, now wife, was, and now we've been in Annapolis, Maryland for 8 years. And I finally returned to the water and have been here for a while and active. So in my practice, I come up with customizable mental performance training for individuals and teams. Sometimes it's more didactic, like we're going to do tonight. Sometimes it's more process oriented, where, we're diving into whatever makes sense in the moment, sometimes addressing interpersonal stuff like communication. And we're going to touch on that tonight. I put together a lot of slides here. So, after this first one, I'm going to try to stay on target and be pretty rapid fire here. But do please feel free to, turn off your mic and interject as you want to. And within reason, I'll answer questions. But I might also say, well, we'll get to that, or, we can't get to that, or we'll spend all night on that, right? In any case, in my practice, I try to pull from science and everything that I'm doing, although certainly some of what I do comes from, I think, some acumen that's been built through experience along the way. My Reaching Ahead mental performance model really dissects, what do we control? and while we might want to be in control of everything, what do we have influence over, and what do we maybe need to accept? And there are 12 mental skills associated with each of those domains. And I spend a lot of time, whether it's more performance oriented or therapy oriented, helping people with anxiety. And I do try to make a point of like, I'm wearing this hat or I'm wearing that hat. It's performance or my psychotherapist hat, performance coaching or psychotherapy. In part because if it's performance oriented, it gives me a little bit more freedom to work across state lines. And, in part for, what is insurance reimbursable. So there are some practical pieces to that too. I mentioned performance communication, often helping people with transitions like career stuff, addressing grief and loss, relationships, whether it's romantic, whether it's a, double-handed team. Again, I love working with sailors in that respect, and I have experience working with Olympians, working with America's Cup folks. All the way down to young Opti kids too. So, and a slew of other athletes. In instigating this conversation, Vince asked me 3 amazing questions, I thought, right? I was like, there you go. That's my outline, Vince wanted to check in. Like, oh, so where do you want to take this thing? I'm like, you already gave me it. I know where I'm going. You gave it to me. So his questions were, dealing with the anticipatory anxiety, how to push yourself to take greater risk with safeguards while there's safeguards in place. And then how to prepare yourself mentally for when the stuff really does hit the fan, or can you? And how to deal with the burden of command, sharing the decisions versus making the decisions. So my talk here tonight is aiming to tackle all of those questions. And in fact, the title of my talk is Maximizing Team Performance When Stuff Hits the Fan. I do tend to have potty mouth, by the way, but I figure for PowerPoint, I'll try to keep it clean. Anticipatory anxiety, anticipatory anxiety can definitely serve a purpose, right? It's not all bad, right? Sometimes when we anticipate the worst, we prevent the worst from happening. But it gets out of hand when we have a combination of this overestimation of threat and an underestimation of our coping, right? A sense that there's no way I can handle that thing when maybe you can. And there's no way I'm going to handle the pressure when maybe you can deal with it, right? And so we can try to tackle anxiety, when it's overboard anxiety from those 2 angles. I'm going to incorporate some videos along the way. I'll try to maximize volume here, so there's no issue there. This is a young skier doing one of those big ski jumps for the first time. Listen to their self-talk along the way, right? And I love this quote, by the way. Whether it's skiing, sailing, or whatever in life, courage is doing what you're afraid to do. You cannot have courage unless you're scared. In fact, I first came across this quote when I had just gone, was fresh out of college. I went bumming around the world for a year, and I just stayed with family in Germany, and I'd gotten a job coaching at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. And now I use my potty mouth. I was scared shitless, right? Because I was like, I'm not qualified to do that. Like, what are they doing hiring me? Right? As a young, just out of college kid, I didn't think that I really was competent enough, but I was. Anyways, when I returned stateside as a housewarming gift, my relatives sent me some wine glasses, and it had this quote on the package. So listen to this young skier and notice the self-talk.
Fine. I'll do it. Yeah. Here goes something, I guess.
Let me just make sure. Can everybody hear it okay? I know it's somewhat faint. If you turn up your own speakers.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah, it's kind of, I can't understand it, but I can hear it. Pretty
Yeah,
quiet.
yeah, this young kid's going, here goes something. So you definitely, you gotta tune in, you know, maximize your volume right now, but here we go. We'll see how it goes.
Be fine. I'll do it. Yeah. Here goes something, I guess. I'm gonna jump. Oh, my ski's slipping off. No snow house.
By the way, I find this coach really good along the way with some exceptions, right? Hopefully people heard the coach just said, just don't snowplow, right? And when somebody says don't, whatever it is, right? Like, don't grab the jib there. Whoa, what? Don't wrap the winch, you know, handle the other way. Oh, you know. So it's really important to phrase things in terms of what we want people to do as opposed to what we don't want people to do, right? Because when we say what we don't want people to do, that's what we're programming.
Okay.
Keep it straight and you'll be fine.
Can you go faster on the end run? A little bit? Yeah. Is it any steeper, do you think? Not much?
So kind of matter of fact about some of the threat.
It's longer, just a bigger 20, that's all. It's a bigger 20. I got it.
I don't know if you can hear the breathing, but very fast.
Just the suspense at the top at the first time freaks me out. That's the only thing. It's so fun. Huh? 60 seems like nothing now.
Yeah, just the suspense at the top, right? Like it's amazing how we can build things up, you know. So maybe we get a forecast. It's gonna blow 35 knots. Oh crap, right? You know, and so our bodies and our brains can get worked up, but there's a lot that we can do to take down the threat well in advance of that, and there's steps that we can take in the moment. All right. So whenever we're talking about anxiety, you know, one potential, or let me put it differently. One major thing that goes with this is that anxiety can take on a life of its own. You know, if you can think back to when you were a young kid, or maybe you had young kids and they were afraid of the monster in the closet, and so they hid under the sheets and they cowered, and that monster grew big fangs and got nasty and was really awful, right? But if they got up out of bed and they walked over towards the closet, then as they were getting closer to that closet, that monster, maybe it grew even bigger, badder, more nasty, until the moment that they opened up that closet, and in that moment, right? But then as they open the door, right, there's nothing there, poof. Or maybe there's a mouse or something creating that noise, and maybe we don't like mice, right? But that's a threat that we can handle. And so often, right, anxiety takes on that same kind of element, right, where we build it up, we build it up, we build it up into something that is way beyond what it started out as, you know. And maybe it's something more than a mouse. I mean, maybe it's a freaking raccoon, right? But maybe it's at the same time, it's no monster, right? It's a threat that somehow we can deal with. We can take it on. But we don't know that unless we unpack it a little bit. And so it can often be really useful to ask, what is the worst thing that could happen, right? And to really break it down, you know? And then to break it down even further, well, you know, what's the probability of that? And if that happened, what would be the worst thing about that? And if that happened, what would be the worst thing about that? And what are the chances of that? And if that, you know, low chance thing actually happened, what would be the worst part about that? Right? So really breaking it down. And, you know, I've done this exercise with, you know, I did it with a young woman the other day talking about performance anxiety with music. You know, I've done it with people in the military. You know, I've done it with, you know, one that really stands out with somebody who had a fear of flying, you know. And so, you know, sometimes people have really deep, legitimate fears, right? Well, you know, that plane could crash. Well, yeah, but every time you hop in a car, right, your chances of dying are actually a whole lot more likely in that instance than in an airplane. But okay, you know, so if that low chance thing does happen, what would be the worst thing about that? Well, you know, my kids wouldn't be okay without me. There wouldn't be. I mean, I'm sure they would struggle. There'd be a lot of loss, right? Well, yeah, I did buy life insurance, and there are other people in their lives that would help out, you know, if that worst case scenario happened. And so I guess my worst fears, you know, maybe I can dismantle those a little bit, you know. And so what feels like an unbearable monster becomes bearable enough. You know, we're not looking for it to be wonderful necessarily, but we want it to be bearable enough, right? And of course, mitigate whatever risk in the process. When we're tackling fears, I love this quote from my colleague Sean McCann at the US Olympic Training Center. He's so spot on, right? He says, you're better off saying I'm excited than saying I'm nervous, but you're better off saying I'm nervous if you are. It's much better to be aware of your feelings and address them. You can reframe them slightly, but you don't need to deny them and pretend that they aren't there, right? So, you know, there's actually some research that shows that, you know, if we are, well, first off, in our bodies, anxiety and excitement can kind of feel the same, right? And so much of what happens from there is interpretation. And so, you know, we don't want to force like, oh, yeah, this isn't nervousness. This is excitement. I'm so excited, right? But if you're truly on the fence, right? If these sensations might be anxiety or they might be excitement, you're kind of better off going, yeah, maybe it's excitement, or maybe it's some anxiety mixed with excitement. And the thing about that is that when we adopt, this is what the research shows, when we adopt excitement as the emotion that we latch onto, if we are going to latch onto one, we have an opportunity mindset, right? We notice what the opportunities are. We have better situational awareness, and we can latch on to what's available to us in the heat of the moment. Whereas if we are anxiety driven, we have a threat mindset. We're looking just for what could go wrong, not necessarily how to fix things or proactively avoid situations. So I think I already made this point with our young skier, right? We want to say what it is we want to do, as opposed to, you know, whether it's in your head or out loud, as opposed to what we don't want to do. You know, that golfer who says, oh, just don't put it in the water hazard, right? 9 times out of 10, that's right where it's going, because that's what we're programming. So, it's okay to think about, in fact, it can be quite useful to think about worst case scenarios or what went wrong as part of a debrief. But then after we've gone there, we want to do at least as many mental rehearsals. I usually recommend, and somebody needs to research this, I usually recommend do 5 mental rehearsals of what it is that you want to do, as opposed to what you don't want to do, for every time something goes wrong, right? Whether it was real or imagination. Okay, so I'm gonna skip ahead 2 slides for a second. These are the mind-body ABCs. This is my way of breaking down kind of a structured approach to mindfulness. What's going on between the ears, so that, while we might not have full control over our thinking, we can have a whole lot more influence, right? And this is it's a racing example, but we could apply the ABCs to absolutely anything, right? So in this example, the activating event, the thing that happened. And by the way, I'm looking for a discrete moment when I'm talking about the ABCs. I will often, if I'm working with somebody in my office, I'll throw a pen at them, right? Because I'm trying to convey, okay, no, we're not talking about how you walked up the stairs and then you opened the door and came into my office and then you sat down and then I threw the pen at you. No, I'm looking for the moment of throwing the pen at you, right? And in fact, we could even go more freeze frame than that. We could go the moment the pen was leaving my hand, as it was in midair, and as it was hitting you, right? So there's actually 3 activating events there, right? We have brand new activating events every second of the day, right? We might be tuned into them or we might not be, right? But nonetheless. So we're activating event is the thing that happened and we're looking for a discrete moment in time, right? The B, the belief, I often think about this as being like, if you're reading the comics or the funnies, right? The thought bubble above somebody's head. What are the words or pictures that you would insert into that thought bubble in that moment? And then the C's, consequences, we're looking at what's your mood, like happy, sad, glad, mad. What's the experience in your body? Like, it could be tense shoulders, it could be faster breathing, it could be feeling light, energized, it could be feeling loose, warm, cold, right? But it's the body experience that stems from that thought, right? And so if you're already tired, maybe you become a little smidge more tired or a smidge less tired, that's the kind of thing we're looking for, right? Those little tiny changes that happen, right? And then, there's the behavior, right? So if that B sticks, if that belief sticks, what is the observable behavior? Somebody who's watching you in that moment, what would they see? Well, I had the intention to, no. Okay. What would they see? What are you doing? So with this example of hit the mark, right? Oh, I hate sailing. That guy should have let me in. What a jerk, right? And so this person feels angry. They feel tight muscles, short, shallow breathing. They yell, they focus on the other guy and they sail slow, right? Okay, that B clearly isn't working. We can tell that by the consequences. So, with the idea of freeze frame, let's rewind, right? So, all right, hit the mark. Let's see how fast I can be back in the game. Okay, now with that B, there's a sense of optimism, frustration, some tensing and letting go. There's smooth spinning of, circles to exonerate oneself, right? As part of that penalty. And then focusing on sailing, right? Okay, well, that B seems like it worked pretty well, right? And if we think about it, anytime there's an activating event, there are many, many, many different Bs that could stem from that same activating event, right? And so here's a third menu option, right? I was wrong, I messed up, I didn't have room. Okay, well, taking accountability, we all admire that. So, right, maybe that's a good one. Well, for this particular person, they feel sad, they feel proud, right? In their body, they feel low energy, it's kind of mixed, and they're focusing on the past and the future, but they're not really focusing on right now, right? So if I'm choosing from that menu, I think I'm probably going to go with option number 2, right? So, the idea is that we're trying on different bees to see what fits. And here's an important piece of all that, right? One, well, I'll say this, right? You notice I got the gene button there. I view trying on bees just like trying on a pair of pants, right? If we try to put on a pair of pants that don't fit, right, it's not getting anywhere, right? Likewise, if we try to replace a thought like I suck with, no, come on, you're wonderful, right? I'm sorry, but those, some of you might remember Stuart Smalley with like, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like me. Like, most often that doesn't work, right? Because people end up getting in an argument in their heads. I'm wonderful. No, I suck. No, I'm wonderful, right? And so I'm a big fan of neutral self-talk, right? So if the first thought is I suck, maybe trying on a thought like, well, that sucked. So that the brain can quiet down and now we can focus on the task at hand, right? So here are some less helpful bees, ones where maybe we need to try on a different bee, right? When we have bees that revolve around outcomes, right? For instance, I need to finish top 5 in this race or top 5 in this regatta, right? Or if we have thoughts along the lines of, well, I should do this, accomplish this in sailing, or I must do that, right? When we focus on things that are uncontrollable, these are not useful bees, right? So we often want to shift our bees, the ones we want to try on, are along the lines of process, right? Thinking about how to do something as opposed to what we want the outcome to be, right? Breaking it down into its pieces. Allowing yourself to think about the fact that you'd like to do whatever it is, as opposed to I must or I should, right? And focusing on controllables. Any questions so far? It's okay if there's not. I can keep trucking.
I didn't understand what the B's were. Maybe I missed that.
So the B's stands for belief,
Okay.
right? So when you have an activating event, in that moment, picture that thought bubble above your head, right? Like in the comic strip, what are the words or pictures that would go into that thought bubble?
And then you were talking about say what you want done versus say what you don't want done, like the ski jumper kid.
Yeah.
And I've heard that before. I've had a lot of training with my city job and lots of different things, but I've heard that before. And it just hit me. Is that like the striker who kicks the ball directly at the goalie? Something like that in a soccer game? Yeah,
if he's thinking, don't kick it to the goalie, sure, that's probably right where it's going. Absolutely.
Yeah, watch a lot of my kids' soccer games doing that.
Yeah.
Cool.
And and it can be hard to resist, but if we get practice with it, it becomes easier. I think of a young skier I was working with at one point, a guy in his early 20s who was on a serious path, and he was like an Olympic hopeful at that point, doing downhill stuff. He would always, as he was scouting the course, he'd be like, oh no, I'm gonna wipe out there. And then he'd be like, oh no, I thought the thought, so now I'm definitely gonna wipe out there, I'm screwed, right? And so then he'd be replaying it again and again, right? Like, oh, I should think that thought, oh, I thought it, right? And so it would take on a life of its own, and it would become that much more likely that he would wipe out there. And so, part of our work was to take the catastrophe out of the fact that he thought it in the first place, right? And, thinking of all the times that he had thoughts like that, and it actually didn't happen, prior to it taking on such a life of its own. and making a point of rehearsing what it is that he wanted to do as opposed to what he didn't want to do. But man, it's so easy to fall back into that habit of framing things in terms of what we don't want to do. I think also of like a women's soccer coach I worked with at one point, who, you know, as I was asking about goals, she said, "We will not lose at home this season." I was like, "Okay, but what is it that you want to do?" She's like, "Not lose at home." We just went in circles until finally I was like, "So you want to win at home?" She's like, "Yeah." Right. So we can get stuck in that pattern, but if we catch ourselves, we can do something different. A lot of why we want to exert some influence over those ABCs, over those Bs in particular, right, is because, you know, as we think about the consequences, the experiences in our bodies and impacts on performance, right, it boils down to this, right? If we think of performance on this axis, on the y-axis, and how amped up you are on the x-axis, right? If you have thoughts like, "Oh, it's just another day, here we go," yeah, you know, imagine if you're doing that and you meant it when it's blowing 35 knots, you'd have problems, right? So maybe you're overly bored or asleep, or heck, at that point you must be on drugs or something, right? You're over here, it's harder to perform, right? But if you're over here, if you're overly angry or anxious, it's also harder to perform. Doesn't mean that you can't, it just makes it a whole lot harder. Somewhere in the middle is the sweet spot, right? And we can get there by accident, or we can take steps to be aware of where we are in the first place and to try to get there intentionally, making sure that we get amped up enough on purpose, making sure that we're chilled out enough on purpose, right? But you got to recognize where you are at the first place to influence it. And our Bs have a big influence on where we are, right? For instance, the shoulds, oh, I must get this outcome, right? That's the stuff that brings us oftentimes to the right side of the curve. You know, not to mention our tone with ourselves, or for that matter, with other people. You know, I encourage you all to map your own inverted U's, you know, because I put together so many slides here. I don't think I'm going to take the time to have you map it right now, but I encourage you to do it really soon, right? And I'm happy to give you a PowerPoint slide where you can actually go ahead and map yours really easily. Here's an example of how I've mapped it with people in the past.
Hey,
Right.
Tim?
I like to make a distinction between heavy air and light air, right? And so here's an example of somebody having mapped it, right? So we can see, oh yeah, okay, if I'm at a 0 in terms of how amped I am, yeah, I'm not performing. I'm asleep, right? If I'm at a 1, if I'm just, you know, just barely awake, well, yeah, I'm still not performing that well, but a little bit, you know. Whereas if I'm over here, if I'm at a 10, maybe I'm having a panic attack, you know, that's not really conducive to performance. But being somewhat amped up, you know, some anxiety or excitement to get me here, you know, that's actually conducive to performance to an extent, right? So we can become much more aware of the nuances of where we perform and where we don't. Linda, or Linda's husband, it looks like you had a question.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to wrap my head around this performance anxiety stuff.
Yeah.
Are you insinuating that, well, I'm not sure what the hell you're insinuating. If you take an Olympic skier, I can just about guarantee you that that person is not going to be kind of hidey-ho, la-hum-de-dum as far as motivation before he starts that race. He's going to be cranked clear of the right side of your graph, isn't he?
If he was ho-hum, he'd be over here. That would be a problem, right?
Right.
But if he was over here, if he was having a panic attack, now we're talking like Simone Biles.
So you're saying highly motivated is panic attacked?
This isn't a matter of motivation. This is how elevated you are physiologically. And that's going to come in part by what you're saying to yourself.
Yeah, I misunderstood your definition.
No problem. Michaela Schifrin is another good example of being too amped up, I think.
Yep. Yeah, we have plenty of good examples, unfortunately, from the US lately. Yeah. And so your light air curve might look more like this, right? Where it's skewed a little bit more to the left, right? And some of this is going to depend on who you are, you know, maybe your equipment, the conditions, right? But I encourage you to figure out what's optimal for you. And what does it look like on the sides? How steep is your cliff, for instance? You know, if you're a little bit, you know, maybe the confusion over motivation versus being physiologically amped up comes from the fact that I use the word amped, right? You notice that in the literature, right, they call it emotional arousal. Now, I know this is a mature crowd and there wouldn't be any giggles over the word arousal, but I've learned over the years that, like, whether it's adolescence or military or what have you, I'm better off saying amped. So in any case, you know, it's important to take stock of, like, okay, with my particular individual tendencies, do I have a steeper cliff if I'm overamped or if I'm underamped, right? For this person in light air, right, they have a steeper cliff if they're overamped, right? Where performance takes a faster dive. Whereas if they're a little underamped, well, they're performing a little bit better, right? So that's the kind of thing that we want to pay attention to, so that to the degree that we can, we move the dial intentionally to that sweet spot. Now, we don't have total control over it, but we have some influence, you know? And part of that influence is what we say to ourselves, right? We also...
So let me interrupt and ask a question.
Yeah.
Get specific. You're starting a race. The forecast is for 25 plus and an ebb. It's going to be rough. And you're amped up and concerned, you know, a lot of boats. And this is the second day of around the county. And you're out there and you get going. And looking back, you made a mistake. You waited too long to shake out the reefs because you were just too sort of concerned. You were in the moment thinking, wow, these waves are big. God, it's kind of gusty, you know?
Right.
And you're not looking
focused
forward.
enough on what's happening in the present moment.
Yes, exactly. You're not saying, hey, wait a minute. You know, we've sailed in this before. There's no reason we need to have a reef in the main right now, you know? And being conscious of that sort of, where are you? Are you physiologically, are your shoulders tight, you're helming, you know, are you cool, or are you really wound up about this? And then trying to adjust that using self-talk. I mean, it sounds like a valuable thing for me, at least.
Valuable thing for anybody, Vince. Yeah, and you know, a little bit of muscle tension, right? We can kind of, you know, I've got biofeedback equipment in my office, right? Where, like, I could put sensors on somebody's shoulders or wherever on their body, where we could look at how much muscle tension you have, and we could actually very objectively quantify it. Well, you know, for most people, they don't have access to that, and that's fine, right? But we can get better and better at subjectively going, yeah, you know, tuning into my muscle tension right here, right now, or whatever your metric is, whether it's sweat or muscle tension or the butterflies or whatever, right? It can go, yeah, you know, I'm at about an 8 right now. I need to have a nice couple long exhales in order to get to a better place. Or, yeah, you know, I do have some butterflies, but I think I got the right amount. I'm at a 5 or I'm at a 6 right now, and that's pretty ideal for me. So here we go. Yeah. All right. So, you know, one thing to think about too is that, you know, one aspect of performance is not just how, you know, we're sailing a boat, or whether we're thinking about, you know, are there, you know, weeds on the rudder or the keel, or, do we have, do we need a reef in the main or whatever else, right? One aspect of performance is how we communicate with others. And so I think it's important to consider, right? What is your communication like when you're too far left on the U, right? Like, look at this spaced out young student, right? What is your communication like when you're way too far to the right? Bobby Knight here. Or what's your communication like when you're at the top of the U? And I'm sure everybody here has either been the yeller or been the receiving end of somebody being a yeller on a sailboat. And it's no bueno, right? Not only does it not feel good in the moment, but it's not conducive to performance, right? And so we want to be mindful of where we are on our U, in part so that we approach the other person with composure, so that we don't then become their activating event for them to be on the right side of the U. Make sense? Okay. Why you should breathe. So I'm gonna make more reference to Ashley Richmond here later. She's actually a trapeze artist. And I interviewed her and her trapeze partner in preparation for this talk. Ashley actually has been taking a break from her trapeze career and focusing on getting a graduate degree in sports psychology. And she and her trapeze partner had some interesting things to say about communication under pressure. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But one thing that Ashley said was that, while on the one hand, they get really positive feedback on how they perform, that she had been criticized at one point, or they both had been, for not breathing. And she's like, here's an example of when I was not breathing. She's like, you can see the veins in my head. She's like, I'm working hard, but it's harder to perform. In other words, I'm on the right side of the U when I'm holding my breath. When we breathe in a rhythmic fashion, right? Particularly with nice long exhales, so maybe around 4 seconds in and 6 seconds out, which is a longer exhale than most people are used to, right? Then the heart rate follows. A lot of people tend to think like, oh yeah, my heart rate is 60, 70, whatever it might be, and they think it's constant, right? But in actuality, it varies all over the place. We want it to vary, and we want it to vary rhythmically. When that happens, we have better situational awareness, right? Not only do we have fewer racing thoughts where, we're less present moment, but we have better situational awareness such that we're able to take in a whole bunch of stimuli at once and focus on what's most important right here, right now. Pretty important in a lot of contexts, but particularly maybe in sailing when stuff is hitting the fan. One thing that I try to emphasize in my work with people, especially as I'm tackling, high stress situations, high risk occupations. I did a workshop recently with police, or just tackling anxiety, whether it be kind of clinical levels or subclinical, focusing on performance. I emphasize that you want to have a regular breathing practice. And the research literature says that in adopting the kind of breathing practice that I'm talking about, right? Like I was suggesting 4 seconds inhale, 6 seconds exhale, and I like to use a pacer. I'll point you towards one here shortly. When we do that, and when we get heart rate to follow respiration, right? Then what happens is a shift, right? Maybe normally we walk around in the world and we're all wired differently, but we all have our kind of average baseline level, whatever that looks like for us, level of anxiety. And then a stressor comes along. And so it spikes. And then maybe it lingers, maybe it even festers before eventually it goes away. By engaging in a breathing practice of and I try to, in line with the research. And when I get people to actually really commit to this, man, it has an impact. But I often negotiate with my clients on this. Like, what are you really willing to do? What can you commit to? And what I see, particularly with those who commit big, is that the baseline level of anxiety goes way down, right? So that when that stressor comes along, they're much more able to handle it. They're resilient against it before it ever even gets there. So that delta, that increase, that spike is not as big, and it's coming from a lower place to begin with. People are often tackling anxiety here, right? They're trying to use the Band-Aid approach. Oh, okay, now it's time to use the breathing, right? No, we want to do it in advance proactively to buffer ourselves, right? And then we can also use it in the moment once stuff hits the fan, right? But it's a whole lot easier to do that if you've already practiced it in the first place. And it's easier if you're just calmer to begin with, more regulated to begin with. And I tell you, using biofeedback, I mentioned I have the instruments in the corner of my office here, where I will hook people up, whether it's on their earlobe or on their finger, right? I use something called a photoplasmograph, which is a fancy word for light sensor. It detects blood flow and it tells us, estimates heart rate moment to moment. We become able to, assess where their optimal breath rate is, where we can maximize that heart rate variability. And here's some screens where we can do that, right? I recommend, seeking out somebody who's certified to do biofeedback, and I can point people towards referrals. And there are simple devices out there too, right? Like there's an app for your cell phone. It's not nearly as good as something you might use in somebody's office, but this one allows you to do this breath assessment where you can figure out, oh, my optimal breath rate is 5.5 breaths a minute or 5 breaths per minute. Usually it's around 6, but I test people between 7 and then 6.5 all the way down to 4.5 and figure out where is it optimized for you. In any case, here are 2 breathing apps where we can practice breathing at a precise rate. And this is without the use of heart rate variability. This is just, the ball gets bigger, the ball gets smaller. This one's called Cardia, K-A-R-D-I-A. The A is missing here. Cardia, deep breathing. Look for the purple K. And I have no affiliation with these companies or anything. I just think these are great apps. Here's another one called Awesome that I used to recommend to people on Androids, although Androids now can do Cardia as well. But I strongly recommend that people get into a daily breathing routine and really, really commit to whatever it is. You also want to develop good breathing architecture, I call it, right? So, this is what I call homemade biofeedback, right? If you put a hand on your chest and a hand on your belly, then as you inhale, you can feel your belly rise. As you exhale, you can feel your belly sink towards your spine. And notice as I'm doing it, my chest isn't really rising or falling at all. My chest is loose and still, right? And so by practicing that and maybe doing that in conjunction with working on the pace of my breath, right, I can get better at distinguishing between belly breathing and chest breathing so that I'm able to have a more efficient breath, right, where I'm bringing more air into my lungs, to the bottom of my lungs where there's that optimal gas exchange in the bloodstream. Oh my gosh, there's a stink bug on my computer. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, buddy. It's a good thing I'd done my breathing before. That might, whew. In any case, right, like these are ways that we can work on having a better breath, right? The homemade biofeedback, the simple breathing app, it really goes a long way.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if I wanted to try the mindful breathing for 20 minutes, would it be okay if I was taking a walk while I did that?
So we want to actually do this at rest. I mean, certainly, I think there's something to be said for having nice long exhales, even when we're on a walk or what have you. You know, anecdotally, I've certainly found that people have better situational awareness when they're engaging in nice long exhales, whether it's, you know, heck, a military training exercise or mountain biking or running or whatever. You know, when they have as long an exhale as they can, energy management tends to be better and situational awareness tends to be better. And, you know, and talking with some of the gurus, the research gurus in the field, you know, they, on the one hand, they'll acknowledge that, you know, there's no way to systematically measure what's happening in terms of, you know, what they call the baroreflex, when people are exercising and breathing with a longer exhale, but they believe that it is having a positive impact in the same manner as what occurs when you're at rest. So we have our biggest impact, and it's more measurable when we're at rest. Hopefully that answers your question, Diane.
So you're saying that I ought to practice it while I'm at rest, and it will benefit me when I'm exercising too.
Yep. Yep. I find that when people have done this in advance of whatever stressful activity, that they're in a better spot. They have better situational awareness. And in fact, this young sailor put it really well. It actually was a young laser sailor, but top level, who said this. He said, "Your mind's in a fog." He says, "Breathing makes it clear. It helps you focus on the immediate and important tasks and let superfluous thoughts go. It's been life-changing, almost." I love that he said almost, in my sailing. Breathing, it's like laser focus. It gets rid of all the clutter. And, you know, and for some people, you know, I've found that it's not almost, you know, it's not just in sailing or just in their sport. You know, for people with serious anxiety disorders or sometimes recovering from heart surgery or what have you, right? It has big impacts, and the research supports that.
So on the other end of that, Tim, I'm pretty busy during the day and I probably wouldn't take the time, but how about in the morning? I'm just laying in bed. Is that helpful to do it there? Yeah. So, you know, for most people, most of my clients will end up doing it morning and night, but everybody is a little bit different with what their routine ends up being. You know, morning can be nice, right? I mean, I find that it kind of brings people to the top of the U in either direction, right? You wake up, you're still kind of groggy, you do it. Now you actually feel a little bit more alert. You do it before bed. Maybe you're overly wound up. It's a nice way to wind down. You know, here is another ABC chart. And I'm happy to share some of these materials with folks, right? It's in an Excel spreadsheet, but I've combined it with a breathing log also, right? So we've got, you know, an adaptive ABC, a not so good ABC, and a redo, right? But then this person also is tracking each day what they're doing in terms of breathing, right? And so, yeah, they managed to do 17 minutes in the morning. And, you know, for them, they went from being a 6 to being a 4. Okay, I feel more mentally calm and had little butterflies that went away. All right. And then, you know, at their afternoon session, you know, they mark how long that went for. They went from a 2 to a 5. And they said, I was pretty sleepy and it actually woke me up. I feel energized and calm, right? So this breathing technique, it's not aimed just to be more relaxed. It's aimed to actually get the
the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system to work in harmony, right? The parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for rest and digest. The sympathetic nervous system is responsible for amping you up and getting you ready for threats, right? So it gets the two to work in harmony, so we're mentally calm and at the same time physically alert. Although I find that, if somebody has been like overly wound up because of stress or anxiety, or if they're underslept, that they're that much more likely to actually feel drowsy after doing it, right? But assuming that's not the case, then they're just more alert. Okay. All right, Vince said it would be okay if I went a little bit over. How much over do we want to go, do you think? You're muted.
Maybe 15 minutes or so.
Okay. Okay. All right. Good to know. I'll try to stick to that.
I want you to talk about, how I should deal with John and Johnny, and when we're sitting around talking about whether we should tack or not, and whether we've hit the ley line, and who gets to make that decision, and what do we read, and all that kind of stuff. The great debate.
Yeah, I'll make sure that we get to that piece.
Okay.
Okay, so practicing for when stuff hits the fan. I would love mental imagery can go a long way, right? So certainly practicing and then practicing some more, right? Practicing in a range of conditions, that goes a long way, right? But you look at any skill and, you look at the research on mental imagery, right? And when people do just physical practice alone, yeah, they end up improving better at a skill than if they do just mental imagery. But the just mental imagery people do better than people who don't do any kind of practice, right? And when we combine mental practice with physical practice, that's when we bring our skills to an even bigger height, right? That's superior to all three groups. As we're working on improving imagery ability, right, we can break it down in these ways, right? We can build vividness and controllability and self-agency. And by that, what I mean is, whenever I think of this concept, I think of a guy I saw on the plane once, when laptops were like kind of new and people were watching their movies on the airplane. And I just remember this guy who was way into whatever thriller he was watching. He's like, and he like almost fell out of his chair into the aisle because he was so into what he was watching, right? When we're engaging in good imagery, and not just imagery, right? When we're watching video, and we're so into it that we can like the person that we're watching, whether it's us or somebody else, essentially becomes our avatar, right? Where we feel in control of their movements, right? We feel those kinesthetic sensations. That's when we get the most out of imagery. And, and sometimes it can be hard to build up to that, right? Like, so we can start with really basic, like, if we had a little more time, and I encourage you to do this on your own, you can do mental imagery of smelling and tasting a lemon, and man, it can be vivid to the point where you're like, right? Because it's so tangy, so citrusy. And that can be kind of a basic one where we tap into the senses. And then we can do it for sailing in general. And I'll give you an example in a minute from my dissertation work. And we can build up from what feels really manageable to, okay, now I'm performing this in 20 knots. And now I feel maybe that much more prepared for my next practice session in 20 knots. And, maybe, heck, I don't really want to go out in 35 knots, but, I can at the very least, so I've practiced in 25 knots, and I've done mental imagery. I've talked through what we're going to do in 35 knots. All right, now I'm ready for it, right? So we can use video and props. I think a lot of people are intimidated by mental imagery. It doesn't have to be done one certain way, right? There's no one right way. You figure out what works for you and you do it consistently. It can be a nice chance to practice calm, direct communication too, right? And let's see. Oops. Again, we want to incorporate all the senses. We want, it's like when you read a really good book, right? The sights, the sounds, the smells, all those kinesthetic feelings, environmental factors, your emotions, they're all in the mix, and they make for that stronger, more realistic experience, right? So here's an example from my doctoral dissertation where, this is actually prior to GoPros even being around, right? I think we were on the cusp of having that technology, but I took a small video camera and I duct taped it into a dry bag onto a snowboarding helmet. And so I got some in-person, some first-person footage, and I also got some coach boat footage. Get ready to sail. What are the sights, the sounds, the smells? Do you have a taste in your mouth? Use a set routine to allow everything to fall into place for you automatically, effortlessly. Imagine that you've made sure that you're early. You don't have to rush. Enjoying your routine. Think to yourself, taking care of the little things, so the big things will take care of themselves. Cram your main in a few clicks and become powered up. So now I'm just skipping around a little bit. Or perhaps you momentarily ease it a hair, slightly overpowered, and then trim it back in. Notice how flat your boat stays through the process, and feel this flatness translated into speed. Again, notice how neutral the helmet's, and how light you're able to stay with the tiller. As you become powered up and sail the boat flatter and flatter, anticipate and react to the lulls, feeling prepared to prevent or sure what the scene is. So, I think it's a nice example of how we can weave in lots of those kinesthetic words, right? And I encourage you to think about if you create your own imagery script, and I'm happy to hook people up with worksheets so that you're not, having to try to reinvent the wheel here. In fact, I'll give everybody a free month access to my online mental training program. I'll give you a code at the end to do that. But in any case, think of the words that conjure up those kinds of sensations for you. Some of the examples that I was using in there, like the salty air, the maybe the sensation of water getting into your gear or whatever, and you can weave in words. This is where the ABCs and the other mental skills can get woven in, right? Like maybe you weave in like, and you don't like the water, dripping into your gear, and at the same time you're accepting of it, knowing that in the grand scheme it's temporary.
I'm wondering.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, Tim. Can you weave in the reaction of your spouse or sailing partner, like their tenseness or maybe verbal reaction to what's happening, or?
Yes. With the idea that, you're preparing for another form of adversity in a way. However, I think the more you do this in conjunction with the people that you're sailing with, right, the more you're setting up for more optimal communication, right? And I'll get to that here in a second. When I was working with the military, one of the best interventions I did, I kept hearing from people, as they would practice getting into this 4-man stack, and then they would enter and clear a room, right, with weapons drawn, and they'd have to make quick decisions that meant life or death for them and for the people in that room, right? And a bad decision could be really bad. It could be catastrophic. Where somebody would be reaching for something, and they'd have to assess, is that a weapon or is it a baby, right? And they'd be hot. Maybe they just ran down the street. They're wearing these 60-pound jackets, And so one of the best interventions I did, because I found that as they got in their 4-man stack, they would give each other a cue, like a tap on the butt, to say, I'm ready. And then they'd go blazing into the room. But all that tap meant really was, I'm behind you. And so my intervention was, okay, with that tap for I'm ready, assuming there's time, right? Have a nice long exhale or two, right? And even if it's eyes open, some quick imagery of what you think might be in that room based on what you know of that neighborhood, right? So that when you do end up entering and you have it really well rehearsed, you know, where your weapon is pointed, etc., right? So that you have good situational awareness, so you're making good decisions in the moment. And, you know, we didn't do any research on it, but anecdotally, I heard several times that it was really helpful. Here's an example of rehearsing using imagery, using the same kind of clear, calm communication, both for drilling and for actual performance. This is, I don't know if folks are familiar out there, but this is the Blue Angels. You know, so I'm in Annapolis, right? This is big time Navy town. Naval Academy is here, right? So every year at commencement, the Blue Angels are flying overhead. There's a rehearsal day, and then there's commencement day, and it's a big to-do all around town, and everybody's so excited, right? It's amazing. These guys fly in tight quarters with each other. Well, you know, this is an old video, but I think all of these principles, I'm sure, still apply. Check out what they say as part of their rehearsal and how it translates to the real thing.
Those are what they're going to hear on the radio. Some of the guys will close their eyes and they'll visualize what they, and some of them move their hands a little bit. They'll visualize what they're going to be seeing out there while that's occurring. It's like going out and warming up before you picture warming up your arm a little bit, but they warm up their minds.
Everybody is very attuned to the boss and what he's saying, and he makes those calls in the brief just like he'd make them in the flight.
Although the boss speaks a little faster, the rhythm and timing lapse between his calls is proportional, so the pilots get the same sense of timing in the brief as they will once they're in the air. Now, set, gear. There we go, a little. Easing the ball, easing power, easing more power. Stand by the board. Smoke. All right. Wings are level. Smoke. Easing the ball. Easing power.
So every time I watch that, I'm just like, it's freaking amazing what they do, right? And one of the most remarkable things is how much what they're saying on land during a dry land exercise carries over to exactly how they're doing it during the real thing, right? And man, that guy's voice, so steady. I got to imagine that he never becomes anybody's activating event in a negative way, right? In my work with Olympians, I spent a lot of time on communication. And this is how we ended up breaking down their approach, right? Breaking down different kinds of communication, right? The way we broke it down, there's an observation, there's an assessment, there's a heads up, there's an action, right? Observations are, you know, when you share an observation out loud without analysis. For example, hey, there's clouds forming on the other shore. An assessment is an analysis likely accompanied with some degree of certainty, right? Clouds forming on the other shore. I think maybe we're getting a sea breeze. I bet it kicks in the next few hours, right? A heads up is a quick assessment and an indication that action might be coming soon, right? So a little more urgency. And then an action is a specific request with a specific or implied timeline. Now, when next communicated, or when clearly appropriate, right? I think all too often people debrief on everything sailing but they leave out the communication piece. We can absolutely debrief and we can pre-brief. We can make it a regular routine to not just talk about technique and strategy and tactics, or just the how-tos of what we're going to do here. We can also talk about how we talk. And then these descriptors can be ways that we can kind of rate how we're doing, right? And we can think about them largely on a continuum, right? Did the communication come early or late? Was it often or seldom? Was it specific or was it vague? What was the degree of certainty, or, you know, or was the certainty level unclear? Was there a partnership implied with the tone? Or did it come across as more of a power struggle, right? So these, we can kind of grade with these. Okay, some racing examples. The chute needs to come down. No, fuck, we're doing it again, right? I'm sure everybody here has experienced those kinds of moments. No bueno, right? So let me ask you guys, what kind of communication type is this?
Action.
Yeah, it's an action. Early or late?
Late.
Late. Often or seldom?
Hopefully seldom.
Well, in this particular moment, the commands are being given quite often, actually probably too often. Usually often is a good thing. In this case, often is a bad thing. Probably in the grand scheme of what happened, there was seldom communication, and that's why we're getting a big burst, right? Was it specific or vague?
Specific.
It was specific, which is good, but it's kind of too little too late, it seems like. Degree of certainty, yeah, but you know, there wasn't enough leading up to it. Partnership or power struggle? Definitely power struggle, right? All right, next one. Silence for 6 minutes, then very calmly, tacking soon, then there's silence, and then a very tight leave out 5 seconds later, right? So what variety is this?
Observation.
I think it's a heads up.
Yeah, I'd say it's a heads up, but then that heads up is kind of treated as an action, right?
Yeah, soon is not specific.
So yeah, the communication is early, right? But then is the communication coming often or seldom? Way too seldom, right? Specific or vague? It's actually fairly specific, but then the timing is too vague, right? The degree of certainty, well, it's, whoops.
Pretty certain.
Yeah. What's that?
Seems certain.
Yeah. Tacking soon. Yeah, that's not very certain. Well, I suppose. You know, and in some ways, right, it doesn't matter. Like, would you give it a 10 or a 5? What the idea is that by using these descriptors, we can dive into a meaningful dialogue, right? Powership or partnership or power struggle, you know, I think it starts off intending to be a partnership, but really it makes it destined to be a power struggle. How about this? 70% sure we're getting a righty and another 20 boat lengths, might tack, keep you posted. Yep, it's definitely coming in another 10. Likely tacking once we dig into a boat length. Jib trim is sweet right now. Right. So we see
It's kind
elements.
of all of the above, except for
Yeah.
an action.
Yeah, we see elements of all of it. Yep, all of it except action. I'd agree with that. You know, it's nice and early. It's often, it's specific. There's a high degree of certainty. And there's certainly a flavor of partnership. Right? So, shared decisions under pressure, right? I think ultimately the best structure for how you communicate, right? How you make the decisions, it's the best structure is one that the group agrees to, right? For making decisions and for managing disagreement. This is the kind of thing that you want to talk through in advance. You don't want this to all of a sudden be popping up and it's something to figure out on the fly. This is stuff you can talk about onshore, you know, via Zoom, in person, whatever. Some good things to consider as you're deciding how to approach this. What's your team culture? You know, what are your different skills? What makes sense for each of you to take charge of? What are your personalities, right? As somebody who had spent some time working with military for a little while, although I was not part of the military, I can see how a military style chain of command can be really expedient. But at the same time, sometimes two brains are better than one. Hey, has anybody here read Thinking Fast? What's the book? Thinking Fast or Slow, I think it's called.
Nope.
You should check it out. By a guy by the name of Kahneman. I'm like halfway through it. But it's awesome. He talks a lot about what he calls system 1 versus system 2 thinking. And I've heard sailors, I've heard people in baseball, I've heard a lot of people talk about how this book actually drastically changed how they approach everything in their sport, in their business, what have you. So, I mean, he's, you know, system 1, according to him, is it's the, you know, fast, making a split second decision based on instinct. It's kind of like if anybody here read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, you know, it's about what he called quick slicing. You know, it's like when you have whatever level of expertise and you go and you make that decision, right? Which can be good if you're a seasoned veteran, theoretically. Maybe not as good if you're a rookie at whatever it is. Although, you know, you can be overconfident at times too. So yeah, you know, sometimes tapping into system 1, being expedient, there's something to be said for that. But sometimes there's something to be said also for making room for system 2. And so I think you got to talk through when are the scenarios where maybe we need to talk it through a little bit versus when are the scenarios where we just got to prioritize action over consensus. Right? And I can't give you one recipe that's going to work for everybody. You got to figure out what's going to work for your team. One important question is there trust? You know, and by that, I don't just mean acts of trust, but feelings of trust that are earned over time, right? And that can happen through direct experience. It can happen through how you talk about things on land. It can happen through engaging in imagery exercises or, you know, utilizing video where you're making a point of talking about what kinds of cues you're both tuning into, right? Is your communication well rehearsed? Is it seamless? You know, and so as I was exploring this kind of stuff, you know, I thought about, well, ideal practice, right? And then I thought about, you know, honing through practice communication, right? So first off, here's a pianist talking about how she manages to make sure that despite whether or not there's any anxiety, actually, you know what? I think for the sake of time, I'm going to skip this one, but I'm happy to share the video with you after the fact. But she makes the point that if you rehearse something again and again and again and again and again, she doesn't use these words, right? But using Kahneman's words, system 1 kicks in, right? So if you're really anxious, even if you're like panicky, you're on the right side of your U, you're still doing the right thing, right? Because you have it so well rehearsed, it'd be hard to do anything else, right? But it's certainly easier if we use the skills that I've been talking about through this whole presentation to make sure that it's easier to tap into system 2 in the moments where maybe we need to make a better decision, right? So I spoke with this pair of trapeze artists. I mentioned Ashley. Yeah, that was her name. Ashley Richmond was the trapeze artist, now sports psychology student. And she said this is part of why I was like, yeah, we need to have a conversation. She said, I'm a professional trapeze artist on hiatus finishing graduate school in performance psychology. My partner literally holds my life in his hands, and our communication is sometimes limited when we perform, right? So I had to know, like, okay, talk about like having to make well-rehearsed, seamless, fast communications where there's zero margin for error because there's a whole lot of risk. I was like, I got to talk with these guys. And it was a really interesting conversation. I'm going to show you just a clip of it. First off, though, I got to show you what they do. It blows my mind. Anyways, blows my mind. So I was thrilled to have a conversation with them, listen to what they had to say. I think it's really compelling when we think about rehearsing communication and mental rehearsal in general.
I realized that, and Ashley did as well, when we were rehearsing, that our partnership had to be from one mind. We can't have two separate brains going on. This is not, we don't have enough time to communicate in the moment of our act that, I think we should do this. No, I think this is feeling this. So when we would be training and rehearsal, all of our skill sets, if they're independent, and then when we string them into our acts one after another, it was kind of a sign that this skill Ashley's in control more, and my skill I'm in control more. And there's a following, there's like a follower and a leader, and that would turn on or go back and forth like a ping pong, back and forth of who kind of was in control of that situation. So if either we're doing this in a skill performance or like in a choreography that's stringing from one skill to the next, when something wouldn't be right or something would be off, the person that was playing that leadership role or the brain role, they would either say we're okay or like regroup or whatever the cue is, and it'd be very minimal of a verbal cue that we would communicate, because you don't have a lot of time to have this big conversation when we're in the act.
Right, one word, and I assume delivered like calmly, but
yeah,
clearly.
like good, like it's like, or like okay, or like again, or some kind of a cue like that we would have that would signify like what's going on, because when something would go on, when something would go wrong, we both knew it. We didn't have to communicate that, hey, there's something wrong, because it's like there's such a chain between us that you can feel when something's weird or it's not like how it is in rehearsal. So it was just more of like, what's the correction that needs to get done? Are you okay? Do you need that kind of thing?
And another thing, we had safe positions that we knew we could go back to. So one is just when we're simply, he's attached to the bar and I'm hanging underneath him. And so if things go awry, we know if we can get into one of these safe positions quickly, we can start anything from there. So part of it is knowing, I mean, obviously, because what we do is very dangerous, we talk about safety a lot and have plans. So preparation is part of it as well. We would sit and talk about the different ways that like a skill could go wrong and how we could get out of that and rehearse it as well. If there were things during rehearsal that it was apparent, okay, this is something that has like a high likelihood of happening, or you know, so we should rehearse that. So we would have different ways to like get out of the skill or whatever. But again, just getting back to that hanging position was always a way for us to reset. And the other thing that we had safety-wise is if we were over a safe surface, like for example, when we are over water or when we are over a mat or something like that, if either of us said the word down, it meant to let go. And so that was, and if I'm saying it, I know that if I drop, I'm at a safe, I can get myself to the ground safely. But that was just always something that we had in our vocabulary, was no matter what is happening, I need down, or no matter what is happening, I need to drop you. And then, so that was a way that we always had, like I said, preparing for these different scenarios that could come up.
Fascinating, I think. What from what we've been talking about with regards to communication could you all see applying to your own sailing in partnership with one or more people?
Well, obviously, any maneuver you do on a sailboat, I try and talk through it, and like jibing the spinnaker or whatever. So that's important.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important not just to talk about, techniques when things are going well, right? But to also talk through and engage in imagery, et cetera, and including rehearsing what is your self-talk in these situations when things don't go well, right? So yeah, maybe we just jibed the spinnaker and we got blasted with a 20 knot gust, and how do we keep from broaching?
One of the things that Linda and I have found is that when stuff hits the fan,
Mm-hmm.
my default mentally is to do everything possible to mitigate the particular problem and cut out anything that is in any way a distraction to it. One of the things that I cannot do is vocalize when I am in that high-speed mode of correcting the dripping stuff off the fan blades.
You go into the singular mode there.
Linda
right?
has adapted to that by realizing that verbal communication is not going to be one of the things that is going to move between us. And we have sailed together and done a lot of other things together long enough that she has either already assessed the situation and gone to the steps that she realizes she is incumbent upon to remedy. So it's a form of nonverbal communication. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but
Probably in part, yeah. And it's so well rehearsed.
Probably in part.
yeah.
What's that, Linda?
Oh, I was just repeating what you said so he could hear.
And I happen to be kind of deaf, so that helps.
We're talking about how to sail when you're aged. Communication is a problem.
What?
Well, I think we've all experienced the pass duck decision in a race, and you sit there and say, well, I'm going to pass the boat in front of us. And next thing you know, you're not going to get through, and you don't get a ton of time at that point to have a big conversation about the next stack that's coming.
Right. And, not only ideally have you engaged in imagery of those kinds of scenarios, right? Just like Michael Phelps engaged in imagery of his goggles filling up with water, and then it ended up happening. We're in a sport where hopefully we talk through what that's going to look like with our partners, right? So that we're that much more ready for it. We're on the same page, so that we can all be like the Adamses over there, huh?
I think one thing that, I sail with Johnny here and John, and we've sailed a lot together. And we get that same kind of silent communication, well-rehearsed, seamless sort of action. But I do think that there's you can get routine or stale and don't push yourself and don't keep learning. And there's something about that too. And it was one of the reasons I wanted to, bring you on, was to kind of think about, well, what could we be doing better? I mean, we've been doing the same damn thing for years and years and years. And, are there things that you could improve on? And what you've brought to the table is helpful. I've got a number of things that have occurred to me here.
Good. Yeah, I'm hopeful that you walk away from this with some thoughts about how to be more aware of what you're saying to yourself in the first place, right? What you're saying to other people and how that impacts them, good or bad. Where you are on the inverted U, and what you can do to influence that, and how you can avoid sending somebody really far to the right on their inverted U. They're responsible for their own self-regulation, right? And at the same time, you don't want to be a factor in sending them over the edge if you can help it. And then there's this communication piece, right? Like, we want to communicate often. We've got some good descriptors here. We want to communicate specifically. We want to weave in this mixture of observation and assessments and actions, etc.
I think it's really helpful in a lot of ways to just pay attention. I'm curious about a couple things that we do individually. Kind of, it's a team thing, but we might individually visualize what's ahead or how things are going to go, but also to share that visualization, which I think we do sometimes. We're like, hey, we're going to go out here, we're going to do this. This might happen here. We could hit that there, but intentionally do that shared visualization. I think if you were doing an individual thing, then you're only doing it with yourself. Or if you're trying to pump yourself up, it's for yourself. But really evening it out when you're with a team and you're intentionally sharing, like, all right, this is what we're going to do. This could happen there. If this happens, we're going to, we're probably going to do this, like really just visualizing. I think we've done it.
Yeah, you're spot on.
Out of it. But I think it's a really good thing to remember. I think that the whole thing that all of us have experienced is someone yelling, hey, don't do that. Somebody yelling about whatever in all of our lives, like, hey, and that the negative messaging is so not helpful, especially in times of pressure. So I think that that's a good thing to remember.
Right. At a minimum, it's distracting. And it has the potential to create a self-fulfilling prophecy that you are actually going to do exactly that thing that you're setting out not to do.
So what are some good, I mean, I assume that you can use these techniques, although I'm struggling a little bit with how I would do it in a situation where you're extremely fatigued. So, and I understand that, we want to keep, and I'm talking about R2AK here. And if R2AK is anything like the Washington 360, Lance Armstrong really only does day races. He recovers in between and all that. This is like a race where you're physically on pretty much the whole time. And so what is the best way to take these tools and then try and apply them when you are exhausted? You're like basically compromised.
Good question. I think, first off, have it so well rehearsed that you can do it in your sleep, almost literally. Right. And that's that perfect practice makes perfect. That's where, you want it to become system one. And we didn't really talk about it tonight, but you also, you want to prioritize sleep and rest when you can. Sleep in particular, not just rest. Right. So to set up watch in a fashion where somebody is actually able to end up experiencing some deep sleep, not just really short watches, really being strategic, thinking about who's the night person, who's the morning person, like what are their typical tendencies? Do they tend to be a lark or an owl in the rest of their lives? Really talking that through and making sure that people are as rested as possible. I think it's a really commonly held fallacy that, well, if we train tired, then we can perform better tired, right? And talking with some of the best sleep researchers in the world, right? Plus from my own experience, right? And I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this. It doesn't work that way, right? Optimal training is optimal training. We've learned better when we're rested, right? And then that training comes through, ideally when we're still rested, but even when we're not.
Okay.
I wanted to add something about communication. You said that all the teams are different in terms of what they want and who's communicating what to whom and under what circumstances. But one thing I've noticed pretty consistently from different race teams, different race skippers, as well as cruising, is that more often than not, the person at the helm would prefer not to be told what to do. So the action command, like turn now, but rather given information so they can decide what to do. Like you're 6 feet from the dock, you're 5 feet from the dock, or whatever. That is exactly something you can communicate about beforehand.
Yeah.
And over the course of multiple races, I've had, fairly heated exchanges when the skipper, when I do something other than tell the skipper, here's your information you need. If I start telling them what to do, then it can get a little heated. But if we do it beforehand, say, don't just focus on providing information, or focus on providing information and advice, but not direction, or whatever the case may be. One notable exception that I think stands out to me from your example of building trust, one of the skippers that I've raced with the most was at the helm when we were cruising, and I didn't have time to think or react. I just yelled at him at the top of my lungs, "Hard port now," and we managed to dodge putting a giant hole in the boat with a tree that was standing up from under the water. So trust goes a long way in terms of that. I knew that, I didn't have time to think, and I didn't really have time to provide advice, even if I had.
Right.
Literally the only thing that worked and that could have worked was immediate reaction right there. And luckily in that situation it did.
Right. And I think everything that you're describing is the kind of thing that we can talk through in advance, right? Like ideally we get lots of practice and lots of time on land to talk things through. But even if it's like, hey, we're sailing with people for the first time, let's talk through on the way out to the race course, you know, how do you like communication? Okay, you're driving. Do you like it when I call tactics such that like I tell you where to attack and stuff? Or do you really just want observations or assessments, and then you're going to make all the action calls, you know? And different people prefer different things. You know, it can be really collaborative. It can be sometimes the driver is really, they're the speed guy and they need to just focus on keeping those telltales flowing. And, you know, somebody in the crew will call all the tactics, or sometimes the skipper is completely in charge of, you know, speed and tactics. Yeah.
I think, yeah, I mean, I think what Vince said, but also we tend to fall into our known strengths, which I think you spoke to a little bit. And there is something to be said about not falling into that pattern of your known strengths, and mixing it up a little bit so that
you don't get stale. You don't assume everything. Yeah.
We fall right.
That's a great point. And I think that's part of why people often don't debrief, or for that matter, pre-brief on communication. I feel like it's, you know, either it's not a strength or is somehow perceived to be weak or unnecessary to talk it through, you know, whatever the excuse. But man, it goes better when you talk all this stuff through in advance, you know, and picture it.
Yeah.
Other thoughts, comments, or questions?
Tim, can you put the slide on of the original questions that Vince asked so I can take a picture and remember it?
Yeah, you bet. And I'm happy to provide Vince with a PDF he can share with you guys. I mentioned, by the way, my mental training platform. If you guys want to check it out, it's www.reachingahead.thinkific.com. This is my regular website. This is my self-paced mental training site. And like I said, you can get a month free and you can cancel after a month if you don't want to keep going. I think it's $12 a month, which actually is a screaming deal for what it is. It's over 20 hours of video content and worksheets, etc. So the questions that Vince had originally asked is right here.
I want him to remember, but I also got to mess with him a little bit. So yeah.
Well, Tim, thank you very, very much. If nobody else has questions, I think this is a great presentation. We really I thank you for taking the time and helping us out.
My pleasure. Do feel free to reach out, and thanks so much for inviting me, y'all. Have a great night.
Okay, Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Tim.
You bet. Night.
Almost 2 hours.
Oh, good. That was good, Vince. Oh. So
I agree. They're pretty darn valuable stuff, but having to assimilate it all is pretty tough too.
well, we can watch the replays. It'll be on our YouTube channel in a week or two.
Yeah, on that note, you want to stop recording, Diane?
Yes, good
Thanks.
point.
Speak of less thing to do.